They had watched the planet for decades. From the vast quiet of their observation posts, Earth appeared unremarkable, its pale blues and scattered greens too fragile, too exposed to last long against the weight of the galaxy's greater powers. The fleet commanders who drew the first assignments to chart human progress returned unimpressed. They spoke of creatures still divided by borders, driven by short-lived quarrels, and chained to a world whose resources seemed woefully underutilized. To those who studied the rhythm of conquest, Earth was another easy prize, and humanity another primitive obstacle that would fall as countless species had fallen before them. The decision was made in silence, and with no ceremony. A simple directive carried across encrypted relays: secure the world, harvest its wealth, bend the population into the labor markets of the empire. It was a routine order, executed countless times in countless systems. The fleet that departed carried no doubts, for doubt had no place in a machine that had worked so flawlessly for millennia. To the invaders, humans were animals given a veneer of civilization, and animals could always be broken. The ships arrived without fanfare, their gravity shadows dimming the satellites and blotting the skies above the colonies. Stations orbiting in quiet arcs around Earth and Mars were the first to be cut down. Hundreds of thousands died in those first hours, most never realizing they had been attacked until fire consumed them. Precision bombardments struck at shipyards and energy grids, erasing in seconds what had taken humanity generations to build. From orbit, the fleet's commanders watched the planet's surface convulse in confusion and panic, their calculations cool and detached. By every measure, resistance should have collapsed. Yet something stirred. The invaders expected submission, but what came instead was a cry of fury that echoed across every channel and every city. Alarms rose, not as wails of despair but as calls to arms. Soldiers scrambled, but so did miners, engineers, and farmers, all seizing whatever weapons could be brought to bear. Across shattered colonies, men and women fought tooth and nail to keep survivors alive. Entire crews went down in burning ships, firing until their hulls broke apart. Civilians who should have fled instead dragged the wounded to safety, only to return to the front lines armed with makeshift weapons. From the alien vantage, this behavior was irrational. They measured war in efficiency, in casualties weighed against strategic output, in victories counted before the battle began. But humans fought for something unseen, something that distorted every probability matrix. Even in loss, they made the invaders bleed. A patrol cruiser expected to pacify an orbital zone in minutes was instead harried for hours by swarms of jury-rigged fighters that should not have been able to fly, let alone strike coordinated blows. A fleet detachment advancing on Mars reported heavy losses inflicted by outdated artillery that should never have pierced their shields. Each engagement that should have been clean turned into a mire of unexpected defiance. The commanders recorded these incidents as anomalies at first. But the anomalies multiplied. There was something in the way humans moved, something in the way they clung to every inch of soil, every breath of air. It was not simply survival, but defiance so profound it unsettled even the most disciplined soldiers. For every city toppled, there were voices shouting through static-filled transmissions that the fight was not over. For every stronghold destroyed, 3 more seemed to rise in its shadow. And for every human who fell, another picked up their weapon, not as a soldier, but as someone unwilling to allow strangers to dictate the fate of their home. The invaders had grown accustomed to silence after conquest. Worlds usually bent, bowed, or died quietly once resistance collapsed. Earth, however, refused silence. The cries of its people carried across the void, raw and furious. To those listening, it sounded less like a species in defeat and more like a world waking to rage. The fleet commanders could not put it into their reports, but many felt it, a disquiet, an unease they had not known in generations. Something about this war was different. When the first human counterattack struck, small, desperate, and doomed, the aliens finally glimpsed the truth they had failed to account for. The fleet's weapons cut the assault apart, but not before humans inflicted real, bloody damage. Losses were not catastrophic, but they were humiliating. The attackers should not have stood a chance, and yet they carved their names into the battle with fire and iron. The reports concluded with sterile numbers and graphs, but within the ranks of the invaders, a phrase began to circulate quietly: the humans do not fear us. They hate us. And hatred, unlike fear, could not be extinguished by fire. The silence that followed the first days of fire was unlike anything humanity had ever known. Broadcast networks flickered with broken signals, cities smoldered under alien bombardments, and families grieved beside the ruins of homes that had stood for generations. Yet in that silence, something took shape that no enemy calculation had prepared for. Grief hardened into resolve. What the invaders had mistaken for a fractured species was in truth a mosaic, and each fragment, divided by language, culture, and history, now locked together under the weight of shared fury. Memorials began before the dust had settled. Across the battered colonies and the scarred earth, survivors gathered among the debris to name the dead. They spoke the names not as whispers but as vows. Families clutched photographs, soldiers laid helmets in neat rows, and leaders bowed their heads, not for ceremony, but for unity. Broadcasts carried the images across every surviving network, so even in ruins humanity saw itself not as broken, but as one. The faces of lost children, parents, and comrades became the rallying banners that no fleet could erase. From these ashes stepped the figure who would embody that fire. He was not the strongest soldier or the most decorated general. His uniform carried scars of battles fought not in triumph but in endurance. He bore no illusions about victory, yet he carried words that could ignite where weapons failed. Commanders looked to him not for strategy alone but for the voice that gave shape to their rage. He had buried his own family in the wreckage of the first attacks, and when he stood before the councils, he spoke as one of them, not above them. "They think us broken," he said, voice steady, "but they have only forged us together." His words spread faster than any transmission of orders. The councils themselves mirrored this transformation. Once fractured by politics and rivalries, they now gathered in urgency. Arguments remained, but beneath them lay an unshakable agreement: survival demanded unity. Scientists who once competed for patents now exchanged discoveries without hesitation. Militaries shared intelligence once considered too sensitive to disclose. Even ordinary citizens, once distant from the affairs of war, volunteered to join reconstruction crews, medical teams, and resistance networks. Humanity's scattered differences became an arsenal, every skill and every craft bent toward the singular goal of enduring. Strategies formed quickly, not out of arrogance, but necessity. What weapons remained would be used with precision. What resources could not be spared would be repurposed. Colonists stripped habitats to build makeshift fleets. Engineers pulled forgotten blueprints from archives and revived technologies considered obsolete. Where alien fire had struck hardest, humans struck back with cunning, setting ambushes, sabotaging patrols, and sowing confusion through sheer unpredictability. "We are not prey," the commander declared. "We are the fire that burns back the dark." It was not rhetoric, it was instruction, and every corner of humanity listened. This spirit did not manifest only in soldiers. Farmers carried rifles alongside their harvest tools, guarding refugee convoys through the wastelands. Miners turned their drills into weapons capable of piercing armor. Students too young to serve by law carried messages through enemy-occupied zones, knowing capture meant death. Every human role shifted into defiance. The war was not fought by armies alone, but by entire populations who refused to surrender their home. The first organized counterattacks were costly, yet they revealed what the invaders had failed to understand. Where the enemy expected civilians to scatter, they found resistance networks. Where they expected destroyed factories, they found new ones rising within weeks, hidden in valleys, caves, and oceans. Losses were mourned, but never wasted. Each life taken fueled the determination of those who remained. In this way, every death was transformed into another reason to fight, every ruin into another fortress, every act of brutality into another unbreakable vow. The alien war machine had prepared for numbers, for weapon stockpiles, for predictable measures of resistance. It had not prepared for a people who carried their dead into battle not as burdens, but as torches lighting their path. The commanders could not measure what drove the humans forward, for there was no figure to calculate the weight of love for one's home, nor any algorithm to account for fury born of injustice. As weeks turned to months, humanity's will coalesced into something the galaxy had never witnessed before. Not an empire hungry for conquest, nor a rebellion begging for survival, but a species that refused to yield. In every strike, in every desperate defense, in every whispered oath spoken over graves, humanity carved its message into the void: we are still here. And as that message spread, carried on the defiant transmissions of soldiers and the steadfast resolve of civilians, one voice rose above them all, clear and unshaken. "They think us broken," the commander repeated. "But they will learn." The words did not echo as a promise, they resonated as an inevitability. The invaders had expected resistance to taper with time. By the third cycle of their campaign, most conquests usually collapsed into submission, their populations either absorbed or erased. But with humanity, each passing day brought new complications. Reports streamed back to the fleet command filled with contradictions that could not be reconciled. Squadrons equipped with superior technology were vanishing without trace. Patrols meant to secure resource zones returned with heavy losses or not at all. Entire sectors expected to fall easily were instead locked in endless struggle. The projections that had once promised swift victory now showed nothing but attrition. In war councils aboard alien flagships, confusion mounted. The tactical minds that had mapped thousands of victories now faced scenarios that refused to follow established patterns. Humans refused to fight as anticipated. They did not defend in straight lines, nor collapse when outnumbered. Instead, they struck like sparks, flaring in unexpected places, forcing the fleet to divide its strength again and again. What should have been minor harassment drained resources at a scale the Empire could scarcely tolerate. The commander's algorithms, flawless in every prior war, faltered before a species that seemed to thrive on chaos itself. At the core of this defiance was ingenuity. Humans wielded whatever they had with lethal creativity. Outdated missiles were modified with scavenged components to bypass shields never designed for such primitive unpredictability. Cargo ships, stripped and re-engineered, became weapons capable of ramming through armor plates. Entire communication networks were hijacked by human coders, filling alien channels with disinformation that scrambled orders and sowed panic among distant units. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of metal, every fragment of data, every captured fragment of enemy technology was reshaped into another blade against the invaders. What unsettled the fleet even more than the tactics was the psychology behind them. When most species broke, they begged for mercy or scattered into irrelevance. Humans did either. Even when cities were flattened and millions lay dead, survivors emerged with eyes burning, determined not merely to endure but to strike back. Interrogations of prisoners revealed no submission. Instead, they stared down their captors with hatred unmasked, spitting words that could not be translated into terms the fleet understood but whose venom was unmistakable. Entire populations seemed possessed by a single shared conviction: surrender was worse than death. Skirmishes became lessons written in blood. One detachment reported being lured into a derelict station, only to find it wired with explosives triggered by volunteers who stayed behind to ensure the trap's success. Another described swarms of human fighters sacrificing themselves to shatter a single capital ship, each pilot flying with such precision that the cost of their deaths outweighed the value of their lives 100-fold. Again and again, the fleet documented acts that should have broken morale but instead sharpened it. To fight humans was to fight an enemy who measured victory not by territory, but by the number of wounds inflicted on their foe before falling. Among the invaders, whispers spread. They spoke of human unpredictability as if it were sorcery. Soldiers who once mocked the notion of fear now flinched when orders came to advance into human-held zones. The reputation of humanity grew faster than their victories, a legend shaped by relentless defiance. Some officers began to argue for withdrawal, claiming the cost of conquest would outweigh any profit. Others silenced them, declaring such words treason. Yet the doubt had been planted. For the first time in generations, the fleet that had never been denied found itself questioning its destiny. On the human side, this uncertainty only emboldened the fight. Each successful strike, no matter how small, was celebrated not with arrogance but with grim determination. The people knew the scale of their enemy, yet they understood something deeper. The war was no longer about survival alone. It had become a test of spirit. Humanity would not allow its story to end as a footnote in the chronicles of some alien empire. Every attack carried not just strategy but symbolism, a reminder to the enemy that they had awakened something far greater than they had intended. As the war dragged on, the invaders began to understand that they were not facing another species to be subdued. They were facing a force of nature, unpredictable and unrelenting, a species that turned pain into fuel and loss into strength. What should have been conquest had become a struggle for survival, not for humanity, but for the invaders themselves. And beneath the statistics and the casualty reports, one truth grew impossible to ignore: the humans would not stop. The war reached its breaking point when exhaustion spread across both sides. For the invaders, fleets once invincible now limped between battles, their supplies drained, their morale fractured. For humanity, every victory came at staggering cost, but the spirit of defiance never faltered. Neither side could claim dominance, yet neither would yield. It was in this deadlock that the first direct parley was demanded, not by human request, but by alien necessity. Too much blood had been spilled, too much uncertainty had poisoned what should have been a simple conquest. When the transmission opened, the alien leader spoke first. His voice carried the weight of countless victories, honed by centuries of unchallenged dominion. He did not plead, but reasoned with the confidence of one who assumed inevitability. He demanded to know why humanity resisted, why they clung so desperately to their shattered worlds when every other species had submitted to the same empire. "You exhaust yourselves against the tide," he declared. "Your weapons cannot match ours, your fleets cannot outlast ours. Why sacrifice yourselves when surrender would preserve your kind? You should welcome the stability we bring. It is the order of history that the strong rule the weak." The human answer came not from strategy, but from truth seared into bone. The commander who represented Earth carried no polished speech, no flowery rhetoric. His uniform bore the marks of ruin, his voice the weight of mourning. Yet when he spoke, it was with clarity that cut deeper than any weapon. "You ask why we resist? You think this is about survival? You think we fight for pride, for arrogance, for some imagined glory? No. We fight because you crossed a line you cannot uncross. You came into our skies, you burned our homes, you slaughtered our families. You attacked our home." The words struck with a force that silenced the alien council. It was not a military declaration but something far more dangerous, a statement of meaning. Every culture within the empire knew of war, of conquest, of defeat. But none had ever faced an enemy who made war personal in such absolute terms. To humanity, this was not politics, not the shifting of borders, not the absorption of another world into a machine. This was desecration. Home was not a possession to be traded. It was sacred. And in attacking it, the invaders had awakened a fury that could not be negotiated away. The alien leader attempted to respond, to remind humanity of inevitability, of the weight of centuries of domination. But the strength of his arguments faltered against the simplicity of that truth. Weapons could be measured, fleets counted, resources tallied. But the will of a people defending their home was beyond all calculation. The human commander's voice carried not only his own grief but the grief of billions, unified into a single force that no empire could quantify. Silence followed the declaration. Even those among the invaders who believed utterly in their empire's destiny felt unease creep through them. They had heard many species cry out in terror, but none had spoken with such fire. It was not the plea of the weak. It was a vow of the unbroken. The words spread beyond the council, repeated across fleets and whispered in barracks. Soldiers who had once mocked humanity now felt the weight of that phrase pressing against their thoughts. They fight because their home was attacked. And if that home burned, they would burn with it, taking their enemies into the fire. Among humanity, the words became a rallying cry. Broadcasts carried them through the ruins, and people repeated them as an oath. Children wrote them in the dust of destroyed cities, soldiers carved them into armor, and survivors spoke them as blessings before battle. The enemy had thought to shatter humanity with fear, but in truth had given them a phrase that crystallized their defiance into unbreakable resolve. The parley ended without treaty, without surrender, without compromise. The alien leader closed the transmission, unsettled in ways he could not admit aloud. For the first time in the Empire's long history, he recognized that victory might not be possible, not because of human strength, but because of human spirit. The declaration echoed in his mind long after the channel had gone dark. "You attacked our home?" It was more than accusation. It was judgment. And it carried the promise that the war was no longer about conquest. It had become a reckoning. The fleets collided once more, but this time the tone was different. The alien empire fought to reassert control, while humanity fought with a conviction that surpassed survival. The declaration had spread like fire, and every pilot, every soldier, every civilian-turned fighter carried it within them. Battles erupted not as desperate struggles, but as deliberate statements. Humanity would not kneel. The skies above shattered colonies blazed with wreckage as human ingenuity tore gaps into the enemy's armor. Losses remained staggering, but the momentum shifted. For every human vessel destroyed, 2 enemy warships fell, their crews demoralized by whispers of the phrase that had haunted them since the confrontation. The invaders soon discovered the true price of underestimation. Human fleets no longer sought to defend alone. They struck into enemy formations with precision, tearing apart supply lines and severing communications. Entire sectors that had once been secure collapsed into chaos as sabotage crippled logistics. Where the Empire expected predictable defense, it found relentless offense. The more the invaders pressed forward, the more their own command fractured, doubts spreading faster than orders could be given. On Earth and the colonies, survivors rebuilt even amid fire. Factories rose from ruins, not sleek or polished, but efficient and unyielding. Weapons were produced in numbers that defied belief given the destruction inflicted only months before. It was not superiority of technology that turned the tide, but speed, resourcefulness, and above all, will. Humanity fought with the knowledge that every fragment of land, every ounce of atmosphere, every sliver of ocean was theirs, and none of it would be surrendered. To take it back required nothing less than unending ferocity, and they gave it freely. The final battle was not won by overwhelming strength but by breaking the enemy's spirit. Alien fleets that had never retreated in centuries now did so in panic, their cohesion dissolved. Officers who once commanded obedience now struggled to hold crews together, as rumors spread that fighting the humans was hopeless. Each human victory reinforced the idea that the invaders were not gods, not eternal rulers, but beings who could bleed and fall like any other. The myth of empire cracked under the weight of human defiance. When the last great engagement ended, the void was filled with wreckage. Human ships floated battered but alive, scarred beyond recognition yet triumphant. The Empire's fleet scattered into fragments, retreating with no promise of return. The galaxy, long accustomed to the rhythm of conquest, watched in stunned silence. A species considered too young, too disorganized, too fragile had not only resisted but forced the greatest war machine in history into defeat. For humanity, the victory was not celebrated with parades or fanfare. It was marked with mourning, with the quiet acknowledgement of the cost. Entire cities lay in ruins, colonies gutted, billions gone. Yet even in grief, there was pride. The people had faced annihilation and refused it. They had fought not for expansion, not for dominance, but for home. In the ashes of devastation, they stood unbroken. Among the invaders, the defeat was incomprehensible. Reports carried back to the Empire told not of human strength but of human spirit. Chroniclers struggled to explain the phenomenon, reducing it to words like irrationality, unpredictability, or madness. But those who had stood in the battles knew better. They had seen humans transform despair into fire, loss into steel, grief into a weapon sharper than any blade. The Empire had not been undone by technology or strategy, but by something it had never considered, a will that refused extinction. The words spoken at the confrontation became legend, carried across systems as both warning and truth. You attacked our home? To the Empire, it was a phrase of dread, a reminder that humanity was no ordinary adversary. To other species long oppressed, it became a spark of hope, proof that resistance was possible. And to humanity itself, it was carved into memory as the foundation of their survival. Generations would pass, and the scars of that war would remain. Cities would be rebuilt, children would grow where once craters yawned, and fleets would patrol not as conquerors but as guardians. Yet the essence of that moment would never fade. The invaders had taught humanity the price of complacency, but humanity had taught the galaxy something greater, that to strike at a people's home was to awaken a force no empire could endure. The war ended not with conquest, but with reckoning. Humanity had been underestimated, dismissed, written off as fragile. Instead, they revealed themselves as something far more dangerous. Not the strongest, not the most advanced, but the most relentless. They fought not because they sought power, but because they had been wrong. And in fighting they proved a truth that no empire could ever again ignore: humanity endures, humanity resists, humanity defends. The phrase echoed still, long after the guns fell silent, long after the wreckage cooled, long after the Empire retreated into bitter silence. It lived in every survivor, in every rebuilt city, in every fleet born from the ashes. A promise, a warning, and a truth: you attacked our home.